Joe Biden was out yesterday talking about the debate. Even he was surprised by the way some of his competitors went after the Obama legacy. Check it out.
I must tell you, I was a little surprised at how much their incoming was about Barack, about the president. I mean, I'm proud of having served with him. I'm proud of the job he did. I don't think there's anything he has to apologize for, and I think, it kind of surprised me, the degree of the criticism. And he focused on immigration, and what he did was serious. The idea that somehow it's comparable to what this guy's doing is absolutely bizarre. There's nothing moderate about what Barack did in Obamacare. Nothing. He covered 100 million people who had pre-existing conditions. He allowed kids to stay in their parents' policies until they're 26 years old. He covered 20 million more people. I hope the next debate we can talk about how we fixed our answers to fix the things that Trump has broken, not how Barack Obama made all these mistakes. He didn't. He didn't.
I was watching the so-called debate last night, and I also watched the night before. That was long television. And the Democrats spent more time attacking Barack Obama than they did attacking me, practically.
So, Jonathan Lemire, that's Donald Trump at the rally where you were last night talking about the debate, which you, of course, watched. What was his big picture takeaway from that debate, beside what he said right there?
Well, despite being our nation's #1 TV critic and suggesting that it was long television, he made that two key points, I think. One, you just played about the attacks on Barack Obama. But more than that, a few moments later, he said this: the Democrats have never been so out of step with the mainstream. And I think that's the point that Joe was just saying, is that the idea of, in those debates, there seemed like the Democrats were bogged down on some issues that are not necessarily that popular among the wide swath of the electorate, whether it is about the borders or about how we're going to pay for health care. And now, of course, the president is going to use this as a divide. He's going to do what any opposing politician would do. But he makes a point there that I think has unnerved some Democrats, the idea that they can be seen as playing too much, perhaps, to certain quarters of the liberal base, and maybe are missing what a wide swath of the middle of America might want. Now, there are arguments either way. Obviously, there's a lot of liberal energy there, too, rightly so. Democrats do have to be mindful of that. But that is where the president is going. And as much as we don't want to overpraise him because of his discipline, because at any moment, of course, he could wake up, go on Twitter, and revive his send her back attacks. But last night, as he sort of did stick to the script, outside of, he did make fun of Robert Mueller's appearance at the hearing, suggested he was sarcastically said he was sharp as a tack. But he largely, outside of that long riff about the American urban centers, which, of course, those are people he represents as well and seems to ignore, he largely stayed on his points about talking about his administration's accomplishments, but more than that, how well the economy's doing. And that is what his advisors have been urging him for months and months, to be disciplined, to stay on that. Of course, it's anybody's guess how long that lasts.
Yeah, well, speaking, Willie, of the lack of discipline, the Democrats decided to attack Barack Obama's immigration plan and be really pushy about it, suggesting that he was heartless like Donald Trump on immigration.
It's nuts.
The ones that kept trying to say that the Affordable Care Act was somehow moderate and came up far too short and was a disgrace and was part of Republican talking points. Those people played right into Joe Biden's hands. Yeah. You saw Joe Biden actually as the defender, the lone defender of Barack Obama and Obamacare. I mean, that's worth 10 points for him. And by the way, if I'm a Democrat, and I'm not, so Democrats, you don't have to tell me on Twitter I'm not. But if I'm a Democrat and I've heard Donald Trump riding Barack Obama into the ground since he's been president of the United States, and I hear Democrats on stage doing the same thing, those people never get my vote. Never get my vote. It was a stupid move on their part, and they better recalibrate, because this is a big plus for Joe Biden.
Yeah, I talked to some Democrats that night who said it felt like we were living in a parallel universe. Are we really going after the legacy of the man we love, this historic figure in our party and in the country? It felt wild to a lot of people, Richard Haas, and it allowed Joe Biden to go out yesterday. And he also said, without the subtext of what he was saying, did you hear all those guys last night? Did you hear all those women last night, what they were talking about? I'm the guy still who's going to go win you Michigan. I'm going to go win Wisconsin. I'm going to go win Pennsylvania. I'm going to get back all the people. There's some wild liberal ideas out there. And you heard him last night. I'm the guy right here who's going to take back the states that cost you the last election.
And that ultimately people like me think is the best path for the Democrats to win not just their base but the center. Let me say one other point. The other thing that struck me was how little the Democrats talk about foreign policy and national security. And when they do, who do they sound like? They sound like Donald Trump. Let's get out of Afghanistan within our first year. We're against all trade agreements. So I actually think foreign policy is one of the great vulnerabilities of this president. And rather than attacking him on it, they're either ignoring it or they're actually saying where they agree. They're isolationist and they're protectionist and how they're coming off. Again, I don't see how that helps them.
Well, Richard, to your point, I wish every Democrat running for president and every chief of staff and staff member for all those Democrats would watch the first block of this show this morning and really think about the state of this election, because it's bad for Democrats. It's really bad. It's not looking good at all. Look at that rally last night and then think about how you're going to present yourself to the American people. When you're talking about our foreign policy, talk about the dangers of Trump's foreign policy, okay? When you're talking about Medicare for all, if that's going to be your platform, have them go to your website and talk about how you're going to take on Trump. When you're talking about anything else, focus on Trump and Trump's racism and division. You're missing like a national emergency happening right now because you're going after Obama, who Joe and I can have a long conversation about here on this show and say, you know what, there are some issues with the Obama administration, which was the presidency that handed off to Trump. There are definitely some problems, but we're like missing a huge moment right now in terms of the Democratic platform and how they're presenting themselves to the American people and getting more votes against Trump. You're going to let him win again. It's a frightening moment.
Well, you know,
and
Mika, if you had just taken that Democratic debate and you played that, let's say 2 or 3 years from now,
my Lord,
you would have no idea that that Democratic debate was set right in the middle of Donald Trump's amping up of racial hostilities, attacking Elijah Cummings,
the head of oversight,
calling him a racist, attacking the city of Baltimore, attacking black leaders across the United States of America, attacking urban centers where there are majority people of color, attacking women of color who are in Congress, leading chants.
And you're going after Obama?
Leading chants in North Carolina to send her back. This, again, this is straight out of a fascist playbook. And yet they're sitting there quivering over what Barack Obama did wrong. They need to wake up, because they just, you know what, they just handed Joe Biden an advantage between now and the next debate. They need to wake up. And I said it before, they didn't listen. That's fine. Nobody listened when we said that Trump could win.
Yeah. Everybody
mocked us and ridiculed us, says, oh, we got this in the bag. So a lot of people stayed home. So I will say to Democratic candidates again, focus on Donald Trump. Okay? Repeat after me. I will not attack Barack Obama. I will focus on Donald Trump and the dangers his presidency brings. It's really easy. I actually tweeted it. You can read it slowly 5 times before you go to bed every night. I'll even do a mindfulness tape for you. We'll get like the sound of bobbling brooks in the background.
Good, Joe.
And I'll sort of whisper.
Don't make fun of mindfulness.
I will whisper. You're like, focus. Your focus. Your focus is on.
Be present and see what's happening right now.
That's what I'll do for you, because I care about you so much. But really, you're letting yourself down and you're letting the country down. So your focus should be on Donald Trump.
Do your deep breathing so I can go to break. Still ahead on Morning Joe, another shakeup in Congress. A surprise retirement from Texas Republican Will Hurd leaves the GOP suddenly without a candidate in a pivotal swing district. And since Joe made the reference, our producers had to do the fact check. Here's the Austin Powers character on the left and the president on the right.
Oh, they don't look anything alike. But they're both Scottish.
Well,
I mean, Trump is the son of a Scottish immigrant.
I think if the emperor had no clothes. You're watching Morning Joe. We'll be right back.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.